No one ever expected Stevie Young, the quiet anchor who stepped into AC/DC after Malcolm Young's heartbreaking decline, to open up about the grudges he carried through decades of rock and roll. For years, he played his role with stoic discipline, never letting his personal feelings bleed into rehearsals or shows. But now, at 68, after spending nearly his whole life in the shadows of rock giants and family legends, Stevie finally dropped the wall. And when he did, he revealed something no one saw coming: the 6 musicians he quietly despised the most. Not in a childish way, not in some dramatic backstage punch-up, but a deep, simmering contempt born from betrayal, arrogance, disrespect, or outright sabotage. These weren't casual disagreements. These were scars carved into the life of a man who watched the industry chew people up, including members of his own family. And when Stevie finally spoke, he didn't sugarcoat a single thing. It all begins with the first name he revealed, a name that stunned everyone because it reached back decades, rooted in the Young family's earliest struggles. Stevie said the first musician he truly hated was a man most AC/DC fans barely knew existed, an early-era guitarist who once auditioned for a spot in the Young family's growing empire. Back in the mid-70s, when AC/DC's rise was uncertain and every rehearsal mattered, this guitarist showed up convinced he was already a star. He dismissed Malcolm's chord riffs as basic, scoffed at Angus's schoolboy outfit, and even joked that the band would never make it out of Australia. Stevie watched the man disrespect a family fighting for their survival, and he never forgot it. That arrogance stayed with him for decades, and when AC/DC became one of the biggest bands in history, Stevie remembered the way that man smirked and said, "You guys will be back playing pubs in a year." Stevie said simply, "I hate people who think they're bigger than the work." Then, as if ripping open a sealed vault, Stevie moved to the second name, a far more public figure, a producer from the early 80s who tried to reshape AC/DC into something they were. Stevie explained that this producer hated the band's rawness, tried to push keyboards into mixes, told Angus to cut down the solos, and even suggested Malcolm step away from rhythm guitar entirely. It was a battle of identity, a war between the band's gritty instincts and the producer's glossy radio-driven vision. Stevie said he hated him not for his ideas, but for his refusal to understand what AC/DC really was: a working-class machine built on sweat, crunch, and simplicity. The producer treated the Youngs like uneducated street musicians who didn't know proper arrangement theory. But Malcolm and Angus stood firm, and Stevie, watching from the sidelines as a younger member of the family, learned to despise anyone who tried to dilute the band's soul. Then came 1988, one of the most tension-filled years the Young family ever faced, and Stevie revealed the third musician he despised, a session guitarist hired for studio polish who didn't last long. This man believed rhythm guitar was beneath him, treating Malcolm's role like something a beginner could play. Stevie said that was the moment he felt real, burning hatred. Malcolm wasn't just an older relative. He was the engine room of AC/DC, the heartbeat behind every riff. Watching someone walk into Malcolm's creative space and belittle it was like watching a stranger sneer at the foundation of your childhood home. The session guitarist lasted barely a week after clashing with Malcolm and insulting the band's dynamic, but Stevie carried that memory for decades. When Malcolm lost his health years later, that old disrespect replayed like a ghost. But if the first 3 names were fueled by arrogance and disrespect, the fourth was fueled by something much darker. Stevie hesitated before mentioning him, not because he feared backlash, but because it tied into one of the ugliest realities of the music industry: people who prey on young musicians. Stevie said the fourth musician he hated was a bassist from an early lineup of a different band on the Australian circuit, a man who manipulated younger players, promising big breaks and management connections that never existed. Stevie had watched him use and discard talented kids, leaving many of them financially ruined or emotionally damaged. Stevie's hatred wasn't rooted in personal insult. It was the hatred of someone who despised predators in any form. He said that man represented everything toxic in the industry: ego without talent, control without care, promises without integrity. And years later, when Stevie spoke about him again, he said, "People like him kill more dreams than drugs ever did." Then in 1994, everything changed when Stevie revealed the fifth musician on his list, a touring guitarist from a major American band who crossed paths with AC/DC during festival circuits. This man had a reputation for mocking other artists behind their backs, but what made Stevie hate him was how he treated road crews. Stevie had grown up watching AC/DC treat their crew like family. The Youngs believed the men setting up the stage deserved the same respect as the ones standing on it. But this guitarist berated techs, ridiculed sound engineers, and once told a stagehand, "You work for me, not with me." Stevie despised that mentality with every fiber of his being. He said watching someone abuse the people who made the show possible made his skin crawl. That hatred never faded, not even after the guitarist's career fizzled out. But nothing prepared listeners for the sixth name, the one Stevie said he hated more than all the others combined. And unlike the others, this one hit close to home. It wasn't an outsider, a predator, or an egotistical producer. It was a musician who once played with a Young family side project long before Stevie replaced Malcolm. This man betrayed Malcolm personally, stealing riffs, leaking demo tapes, and trying to undercut the Youngs by claiming they had stolen ideas from him. Stevie said this betrayal scarred him deeper than anything else. Watching someone target Malcolm, especially when Malcolm was the most generous musician Stevie had ever known, filled him with a lifelong bitterness. The man disappeared into obscurity after the truth surfaced, but the damage was done. Stevie said, "I hate him because he hurt Malcolm. That's enough for me. You don't go after family." By the time Stevie finished revealing these six names, he had painted a raw portrait of the hidden battles behind a life spent in the shadows of legends. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't pretend hatred was glamorous or dramatic. He spoke like a man who carried memories of respect, loyalty, and betrayal across 5 decades of grinding work. And as he wrapped up the conversation, he hinted that the full story behind each musician ran far deeper than the simple reasons he listed. Why? Because every conflict in Stevie Young's life was tied to something much bigger, the legacy he was sworn to protect. But the deeper Stevie went into those memories, the more he realized that hatred was never the core of his story. It was the symptom. The real cause was something far more powerful: loyalty. Because everything Stevie Young ever hated in another musician was tied to how they treated the band, the family, or the craft itself. And in the next breath, he explained something that shocked even longtime fans. He admitted that those 6 musicians weren't the only ones who ever angered him. They were simply the ones who crossed lines that should never be crossed. But there were other moments the world never heard about, where Stevie nearly walked off tour, nearly quit sessions, nearly confronted people head-on. And when he began recalling these experiences, the timeline of AC/DC's history opened up in a way few had ever heard before. Then in 1984, everything shifted when Stevie remembered an incident during the flick of the switch era that he had never spoken publicly about. He wasn't in the band yet, but he was close enough to feel the tremors. A well-known guitarist from another rising Australian band publicly mocked Malcolm's playing, calling it cookie-cutter rock and mechanic-level guitar. Stevie heard it through the musician grapevine and felt his blood boil. Malcolm was fighting through exhaustion, pressure, and the weight of being AC/DC's backbone. And here was a man who had never written a timeless riff in his life throwing cheap shots for attention. Stevie learned early on that in rock music, ego could destroy everything. He wasn't someone who shouted, but he said he saw the coldness, the hypocrisy, the ego, the false praise. He saw musicians who pretended to respect Malcolm and Angus only when cameras were rolling. He watched others try to cozy up to him now that he had stepped into a spotlight he never asked for. And he said that was when he understood why Malcolm was always cautious about letting people into the band's orbit. Stevie said that the older he grew, the more he realized hatred wasn't about emotion. It was about protection. Protection of family, protection of craft, protection of the values the Youngs built long before fame arrived. And as he continued to peel back the layers of his story, he made one thing clear. The musicians he hated were not random enemies. They were symbols of everything wrong with the industry he had survived. Stevie said the strangest part of carrying hatred for so long was realizing how it shaped him as a musician. Every insult Malcolm ever faced, every moment someone dismissed Angus as a gimmick, every time a producer tried to sterilize the band's identity, it all became fuel. And when Stevie stepped into the role left by Malcolm, he carried those memories like armor. Not bitterness, not grudges for the sake of drama, but a sharpened awareness of what the Young family had endured. He said that hatred didn't poison him. It reminded him of what mattered. And what mattered was honoring the legacy he was entrusted to protect. But the next story, he revealed, dug even deeper into that legacy, reaching back to a moment that nearly changed the band forever. Then in 1976, everything shifted when Stevie recalled hearing about a major music critic who attended several AC/DC pub gigs only to write scathing, mocking reviews targeting the band's simplicity, Angus's outfit, and Malcolm's unpolished rhythm style. Stevie wasn't even playing with AC/DC yet, but he remembered sitting in a cramped kitchen in Scotland, reading those reviews that belittled the very foundation of the Youngs' musical DNA. The critic called them unrefined, unprofessional, and a novelty act that will expire like a firecracker. Stevie said he didn't hate the critic because of the insults alone. He hated him because those words cut into Malcolm in a way Malcolm never admitted. Malcolm wasn't someone who cared about praise, but he cared deeply about dignity. And when someone mocked the heart of what he built, it stayed with him. Stevie said he hated the critic because the man never apologized. Even decades later, when AC/DC became one of the biggest bands on earth, some wounds weren't physical, but they were sharp enough to carve themselves permanently into memory. But Stevie's reflections didn't stop there. He then described the hidden pattern he noticed in every musician he despised. They all underestimated the power of discipline. Stevie explained that AC/DC wasn't powered by wild chaos, contrary to the image people had in their minds. It was powered by structure. Malcolm's structure, Angus's precision, Phil Rudd's steady, unshakable groove, Cliff Williams' quiet backbone. And Stevie said the musicians he hated often shared one fatal flaw. They believed rock music was supposed to be a circus, driven by flamboyance or unpredictability. Those were the ones who mocked rhythm players, dismissed structure, or clashed with the Youngs because the band didn't embrace artistic experimentation. Stevie laughed as he recalled one guitarist bragging about never playing the same solo twice. Stevie simply said, Malcolm would have thrown him out in 10 minutes.